exclusive conversation now. A strong vote of confidence for India has come in from Moody's as they've underlined the country's economic resilience, saying it's driven by robust domestic growth and a vast internal market. Despite global uncertainties and US trade tensions, India's low reliance on exports and its thriving service sector act as an effective buffer against external shocks, says this Moody report. It also highlights significant government investments in power, transport and digital infrastructure, poised to sustain GDP growth over the next 5 to 7 years. To talk on this, I'm joined now by Nicky Dang, SVP at Moody's Ratings, for this exclusive conversation. Nicky, thank you so much for speaking with us. Very good morning to you from where we're sitting. Take us through what the key view is coming in on India in relative terms.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. Yes, indeed, as I highlighted, the report highlights India's unique position among this global trade turmoil because of the few factors you mentioned. That is, smaller exposure to the U.S. Goods exports, and plus the strong domestic growth drivers, including large domestic market and very robust domestic assumptions and recovered domestic consumptions. And just to put things in perspective, India's goods exports to the U.S. only accounts for less than 3% of GDP. That really compares to the high single digits or even over 20% of some of the emerging peers India's got there. So it's much smaller exposure here. And another thing adjacent to export, that is, India has a growing share of service exports, and it's growing to almost half, accounts for half of the total exports of the country. And just keep in mind, service exports is not really subject to this current tariff play. And one last thing I want to mention is the large domestic market and domestic consumption. It's the nature of India's growth drivers, and this is further bolstered by the government supports fiscal policies such as the personal tax cut announced in the budget.
Nicky, so to put all of that into a number that everybody looks at, what is your assumption of economic growth for India in the context of concerns, worries about global growth, even though you have a few pockets of strength here and there?
Well, yes, indeed. After the observation of the turmoil coming through the market, after the so-called liberation date with high reciprocal tariff announced by the U.S. administration, in our early May release of our new forecast, we did cut across the G20 growth forecast collectively to 1.9% from 2.5%. For the emerging market in particular, it's down to 3.6% for this year from 4%. India, on the other hand, it did suffer a smaller cut. Our view now is for the calendar year 2025, our forecast is now down to 6.3%, and compared to our 6.7%, the number released in February of this year. And just keep that in mind, India remains the fastest growing economy among the G20. So there is definitely the downside play by what's going on in the rest of the world with the trade disruptions whatsoever, and also the balancing it off with the strong momentum domestic growth drivers is putting in, and together with a favorable credit conditions domestically.
Nicky, I'm wondering, in terms of GDP outlook for India, one key factor which is yet to play out is whatever the bilateral trade agreement is between India and the United States. How do you see that impacting? One thing is for sure from all, from everything we're hearing so far, we're going to definitely end up at a lower rate than 27, where we are right now. Do you think that would be a clear enough indicator to boost GDP outlook for this year, or we're not really seeing any impact one way or the other of the current tariffs?
I think that's definitely upside for India's growth, and especially for planting India's economy more into the global supply chain, right? So we saw early May, India and UK secured the free trade agreement, and the trade deal really suggests the trade liberalization is becoming a pillar to the broader policy response to the U.S. Tariff shocks in here. And this is in contrast to India's historical moves where more protectionist the trade policy is in place. And with the continued negotiation with EU and the US, latest news has Commerce Minister just finished the 4-day of a trip visit to the White House, and with a now 3-phase timeline, with an initial pact signed with the US expected before July, and the comprehensive agreement concluded by the next year. So this is all going in favor of plugging India more so in the global supply chain. And this is a kind of in conjunction with government's manufacturing push, which has stalled, in recent years, where you see manufacturing contribution to GDP kind of is half of where the government would like to see, like 25%, but we're staying at 13%. At the same time, employment for industrial employment only accounts for a quarter of the total employment, compared to high 40% for agriculture. So I think this is definitely in India's favor.
Nicky, I do realize that you don't specifically comment on sovereign rating. So I'm not asking a pointed question. I'm asking directionally, right? So given what we've spoken about India, and also the fact that there is an element of fiscal prudence from the perspective of the government and the way that it has approached its budget, the way that it's spending, corporate balance sheets have improved. Directionally, do you think that all factors are moving in the right direction for a better rating for India?
Well, there are, I take everything you just said, the positive momentums on economic strength, right, for India. But, in terms of again, this is not my subject, I'm not a subject matter expert for sovereign rating. But one thing we do focus on, in addition to the economic strength, is really the physical strengths, right? So we did see physical consolidation gradually coming in for the government. But I mean, the pace has slowed down in the recent, I think, the fiscal year, as reflected in the budget. And I think in order to compare with the peers, right, similar rated peers within the global portfolio that we have for sovereigns, I think the physical metrics are not boding too well or positioning India too well for next rating level.
Okay, Nicky, thanks so much. And for answering that last question in particular, I think a lot of people here in India are looking at this very closely. But the outlook that you pointed out to will also bring a smile to a lot of faces today. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.